Welcome to Nicki Woo Cozy Stories. I'm your host, Nicki. Tonight's story is called The Queen Bee. So get comfortable, settle in, and let the story begin. There was once a small house standing at the edge of a great forest where 3 brothers lived with their aging father. The house had grown old along with him. Its roof leaned slightly beneath years of wind and weather. Ivy climbed one side of the chimney, and in the spring, the narrow garden beside the kitchen door filled with herbs that no one remembered planting. Bees drifted lazily among the blossoms there, and birds gathered each morning beneath the apple tree, as though the house had quietly earned their trust. The eldest brother thought very little of such things. He was strong, quick-tempered, and certain that most problems in life could be solved by moving faster, speaking louder, or forcing one's way through. The second brother admired cleverness above all else, especially his own. He liked quick answers, quick laughter, and very little waiting. If the eldest brother dismissed something, the second usually laughed at it. The youngest brother was different. His brothers called him simpleton. They said that when he paused to move a beetle from a garden path before someone stepped on it, they said it when he scattered crumbs to birds in winter or stood too long watching rain gather on the leaves outside the window. "Simpleton," the eldest would say, shaking his head. "You concern yourself with foolish things," the second would add. But the youngest brother never argued. He simply noticed what others overlooked. He fed the old goat before breakfast. He gathered kindling without being asked. And when something broke, he mended it carefully rather than quickly. And though he spoke little, there was a quiet steadiness about him that made even difficult tasks seem less troublesome when he was near. One spring morning, after many weeks of rain, sunlight finally broke through the clouds. The eldest brother stood in the doorway and stretched. "Oh, I'm tired of this place," he announced. His father looked up from the hearth. "Tired?" "Yes," said the eldest. "There must be more to life than patching roofs and mending fences." The second brother nodded eagerly. "There are roads beyond this village," he said. "Towns, castles, and fortune." The eldest crossed his arms. "I mean to find mine." Their father was quiet for a moment. Age had slowed him, though his eyes remained thoughtful. "The world is wide," he said at last. "That is precisely the point," said the eldest. "But it's not always kind." The second brother laughed softly. "We shall manage." Their father rested his hands upon his knees. "There are places where pride opens no doors," he said, "and places where gentleness is remembered longer than cleverness." The eldest gave a small shrug. "I shall rely upon myself." "That," said the father quietly, "is what worries me." The youngest brother stood nearby, mending the handle of a basket. He listened, but said nothing. Adventure had never occupied his thoughts in the same way that it had his brothers. He didn't dream of riches or castles. Still, when he looked toward the forest beyond the fields, something stirred quietly inside him. Curiosity, perhaps, or wonder. By evening, the decision had been made. The eldest and the second brother would leave at dawn. They packed quickly: a loaf of bread, cheese wrapped in cloth, a flask of cider, spare stockings, a knife sharpened carefully near the fire. The youngest brother sat quietly nearby. At last he said, "I think I should come too." The room fell silent. The second brother laughed first. "You?" The eldest shook his head. "What would you do on the road?" The youngest considered this. "Walk." The second learned to smile despite himself, "and perhaps rescue every beetle between here and the next kingdom." "If the beetle were in trouble," the youngest replied mildly, "it would seem unkind not to." The eldest groaned. "You see?" But the father looked at the youngest for a long moment, and then he nodded. Let him come. The eldest frowned. Father, let him come. There was something firm in the old man's voice, something final. The eldest sighed. As you wish. That evening passed quietly. The brothers slept while the rain tapped softly against the roof. Before dawn, the youngest awoke to find his father already seated near the fire. The house still held the hush of early morning. Outside, mist rested low across the fields. You are truly going, the old man said. I think so. His father nodded once. Then he reached into his pocket and held out something small. A little wooden comb, smooth with age. The pear wood had darkened over time from careful hands. It belonged to your mother, he said. The youngest turned it gently in his fingers. She used it when we kept bees behind the orchard. The youngest remembered them faintly. Golden hives near old apple trees. The quiet humming of summer afternoons. She always said, honey should be taken with gratitude, his father said softly. Never greed. The youngest slipped the comb carefully into his satchel. Keep it, his father said. Not because it's magic, a small smile touched his face, but because sometimes remembering kindness is useful on the road. Outside, the eldest brother called impatiently. Simpleton, the second laughed. The days grow old already. The youngest stood. At the doorway, his father placed one hand briefly upon his shoulder. The world notices more than people think, he said quietly. The youngest nodded. Then he stepped outside. Mist drifted softly over the lane. The eldest brother stood waiting with clear impatience. The second adjusted his straps of his satchel. At last, said the eldest. The road stretched ahead between dew-covered fields and hedgerows touched by morning light. The youngest glanced back once. His father lifted his hand in farewell. Then the three brothers set out together toward the forest. The eldest walked first, eager for fortune. The second followed close behind, already imagining grander things. The youngest came last, not hurrying, simply watching the morning awaken around him. A robin darted through the hedges. Sunlight touched the damp grass. And far ahead, where the forest waited in the deep green quiet, old enchantment stirred patiently among roots and branches, waiting for a heart gentle enough to notice them. The forest welcomed them slowly. At first, the trees stood wide apart, sunlight falling easily between their branches. Moss climbed the trunks like green velvet, and small white flowers opened shyly beside the path where the morning warmth had begun to reach them. The eldest brother walked quickly, too quickly for much noticing. He strode ahead as though fortune might disappear if he did not reach it first. The second brother followed near behind. If we continue at this pace, he said, perhaps we shall find the castle before supper. Or at least a warm inn, said the eldest. The youngest walked behind them both. He didn't hurry, not because he wished to slow them, but because the world seemed full of things worth noticing. A squirrel darted across the path carrying something twice its size. Sunlight gathered in the tiny pools upon the fern leaves. Once, he stopped to watch a spider patiently mending the center of its web where the wind had torn it. The second brother noticed. You've fallen behind again. There was a spider, said the youngest. The eldest sighed deeply. Of course there was. It was repairing something. The second laughed. And did it thank you for watching? Not yet, said the youngest mildly, though perhaps it was busy. Even the eldest shook his head at that. Hopeless, he muttered. Still, they walked on. By midday, the air had grown warmer. Bird song drifted lazily through the trees, and the road narrowed into a quieter woodland path where roots crossed beneath their feet like old twisting fingers. At last, the eldest slowed. We stop here. Ahead stood a clearing beneath an enormous oak tree. Its branches spread wide enough to cast cool shade upon the forest floor, where moss grew thick and soft between roots. The brothers sat. Bread was unwrapped, cheese divided. The eldest took the largest portion without asking. The second pretended not to notice, and the youngest said nothing at all. He had long ago learned that some things were easier to observe than argue with. And nearby, a robin landed upon a low branch. The second tossed it a crumb. The youngest smiled faintly. Then the second picked up a twig and struck sharply against the branch. The robin startled upward at once. The brothers laughed. "Poor foolish thing," said the second. "It trusted too easily," said the eldest. The youngest looked down at his bread. He didn't scold them. He simply wondered why startling something peaceful could seem amusing. When they rose to continue, the forest deepened. The air grew cooler beneath the thicker branches, and the path bent gently downward through the old roots in the soft earth rich with the smell of pine and rain. They had gone perhaps another hour when the eldest brother stopped suddenly. "Well now," he said. At the roots of a broad chestnut tree stood an anthill. It rose nearly to the youngest brother's knee, carefully built from pine needles, tiny twigs, grains of sand, and pieces of leaf carried one by one. Thousands of ants moved busily across the surface. Some carried food, others repaired small openings where the earth had shifted. All worked steadily, quietly, as though every tiny task mattered. The eldest nudged the mound with his boot. The second grinned. "Look at them hurry." The eldest pushed harder. Part of the anthill crumbled slightly. Immediately ants rushed toward the broken place. "Watch them scramble," said the second. The eldest laughed. "We could flatten the whole thing in a moment." The second looked around. "There are dry needles enough." He smiled. "We might smoke them out." The youngest felt something quiet inside him grow still. The ants continued working, unaware, patient, busy repairing what careless feet had disturbed. "No," he said softly. The eldest looked over. "No." "Leave them." The second gave a small laugh. "You wish to protect the ants now?" "They're doing no harm." "They're insects," said the oldest. "They are alive," the youngest answered. The eldest nudged the mound again with his boot. Another small piece collapsed. The ants rushed immediately to repair it. The youngest stepped closer, not hurriedly, not angrily. Only enough to stand between the anthill and his brothers. The second folded his arms. "You would stand guard over insects?" "If I must." The eldest brother looked at him for a long time, annoyed, hungry for movement, already impatient with delay. "You care more for ants than common sense." The youngest glanced down. One tiny ant struggled beneath a pine needle, too large for it. Another came, then another. Together they shifted it. "They've built something here," he said quietly. The eldest scoffed. "A pile of dirt." "A home." The second rolled his eyes. "Simpleton speaks for ants now." The youngest smiled faintly. They seemed busy. For a moment, no one spoke. The forest moved quietly around them. Leaves whispered overhead. Sunlight shifted softly across the mound. And the eldest sighed heavily. "Fine." He stepped back. "Let the creatures keep their little kingdom." The second tossed aside the branch he had picked up. "One day your softness will become troublesome." "Perhaps," said the youngest gently. "But not today." The eldest shook his head. "You are truly impossible." Yet he had already turned back toward the path, and the second followed after him with a visible annoyance. The youngest lingered only for a moment. He crouched down beside the anthill. Already the ants had begun repairing what had broken. Patiently, without complaint, he broke off the smallest corner of bread and crumbled it near the roots of the tree. "For the trouble," he said softly. A breeze moved through the branches overhead. The forest seemed strangely peaceful again. Ahead, the second brother called back, "Simpleton! You'll be making friends with squirrels next." The youngest stood. "If the squirrel were polite," he called back mildly. For the first time that day, the second laughed despite himself. Then the brothers continued onward beneath the sheltering trees, and beneath them, besides the roots of the old chestnut tree, the ants carried on with their careful work. Small lives, small kindnesses, quietly remembered. The forest thickened as the day went on. The broad woodland path narrowed into softer ground, where moss spread between roots and sunlight reached only in scattered pieces. Somewhere nearby, water moved unseen through stone, and now and then the breeze carried the scent of damp earth warming beneath spring light. The eldest brother walked quickly still. The younger complained more often. And the youngest continued noticing things. A patch of blue flowers hidden beneath thorny branches, a squirrel carrying an acorn too large for itself, the sudden silver flicker of fish deep within a narrow stream before it vanished again beneath shadow. By midday, their bread had nearly disappeared. The eldest frowned into the empty cloth. "We should have packed more." "You packed enough for yourself," said the second. The eldest ignored him. The youngest had wandered briefly from the path and now returned carrying something in the fold of his coat. Dark berries, small woodland strawberries, a handful of mushrooms. "These are safe," he said. The eldest looked doubtful. "You're certain?" "Yes." "How?" "Our mother taught me." That answer quieted him. Only briefly. Still, hunger has a way of making people less proud. Before long, the youngest had gathered enough for them all. Near a stream, he built a small cooking fire and showed them which mushrooms could be roasted and which should remain untouched. The berries stained their fingers dark purple. The mushrooms smelled warm and earthy. The eldest ate quickly. The second stretched afterward against a fallen log. "I believe," he announced, "that I may never eat again." "You were starving an hour ago," said the eldest. "That was before." The youngest smiled quietly. The forest, it seemed, had provided. When they continued walking, no one hurried much. The brothers were far too full for that. The path dipped lower through the tall trees, where evening had already begun gathering softly beneath the branches. At last, sunlight shimmered unexpectedly through the trunks ahead. Water. When they stepped through the clearing, they found a pond resting still beneath the lowering sky. It stretched wide and quiet, touched with gold with the last warmth of afternoon. Tall reeds swayed softly at the edges. Willow branches leaned lower over to the water, and their pale spring leaves brushing gently against the surface. Dragonflies skimmed above the shallows like flickers of colored glass. The youngest stopped walking. "Oh," he said softly. The second lowered himself onto a fallen log. "This place is worth stopping for." The eldest sat nearby. "At least for a moment." The youngest wandered closer to the water. Then he saw them. Wild ducks. A small gathering drifted quietly near the reeds. Some floated side by side, others tucked their heads beneath their wings. One smaller duck followed another faithfully, paddling close as though reluctant to lose sight of it. The pond reflected everything. Clouds, branches, feathers touched softly with gold. The youngest stood watching. There was something deeply peaceful about them. Behind him, a sharp splash broke the quiet. The ducks startled suddenly. Wings fluttered, ripples spread. The youngest turned. The eldest stood holding another stone. "Look at them scatter," he said. The second laughed and bent to gather one of his own. Again, a stone skipped across the water. The ducks hurried toward the reeds. "They frighten easily," said the second. "That makes it more amusing," said the eldest. The youngest frowned. They were resting. "They are ducks," said the eldest. "And frightened ducks are entertaining." The second tossed another stone lightly in his hand. "Tiny little things. Not enough meat on one to bother with," said the eldest. "No," said the second. "Far too small, but amusing all the same." The youngest looked back toward the pond. The ducks had gathered close together now. The smallest tucked itself beside another, safe only because distance still remained. "No," he said quietly. The eldest sighed. Again, that tone. "No what?" "Leave them be." The second rolled his eyes. "You defend everything." "They have done nothing." "They are birds," said the eldest. "They are alive," the youngest answered gently. The eldest shrugged. "They will forget by morning." The youngest stood quietly for a moment. The evening breeze moved softly through the reeds. The pond had begun turning silver beneath the lowering sky. "They are resting," he said softly. "And evening is coming." The second tossed another stone once in his hand and looked at the youngest, then toward the ducks. At last he dropped it. "You are troublesome." "Perhaps," said the youngest mildly. The eldest gave an annoyed breath. "One day you will choose a squirrel over your own comfort." The younger considered this. "If the squirrel were polite," he said. The second laughed despite himself, and the eldest shook his head. Hopeless. Still, no more stones were thrown. The brothers rested beside the pond while evening settled around them. The eldest sharpened his knife against a stone. The second leaned back against the fallen log. The youngest watched the water. Slowly the ducks drifted farther from the reeds again. The smallest one shook droplets from its feathers. Nearby frogs began their evening songs. The youngest reached quietly into the pocket of his coat. A few berries remained there from earlier. He crouched near the water and rolled them gently toward the reeds. One duck paddled cautiously nearer, then another. Not tame, only curious. The eldest watched with disbelief. "You feed them now?" The youngest smiled faintly. "I think they were startled enough for one evening." The second shook his head. "You belong in the forest." The youngest looked over at the water. "I don't think the forest minds." For a moment, no one said anything. The evening had grown very quiet. At last the eldest stood. "We move." The youngest nodded. Before leaving, he lifted one small hand toward the pond in silent farewell. One duck gave a soft sound in the evening air, almost thoughtful. Then the brothers continued onward beneath the trees, and behind them, beneath the sheltering reeds, the ducks settled once more into peace. Small kindnesses, the forest seemed to understand, were not easily forgotten. By the time the brothers left the pond behind them, evening had settled fully across the forest. The path grew dim beneath the trees, and the warm glow of day softened into silver blue shadows. Somewhere high overhead, birds settled into the hidden branches, while the breeze carried the cool scent of pine and damp earth. The eldest brother walked with growing impatience. "We should have gone farther." "We stopped because of the ducks," said the second. The youngest smiled faintly to himself, but said nothing. At last, when the forest had grown too dark for easy walking, the eldest stopped beside a clearing ringed with fir trees. "Enough." A fallen log rested near the center, and the ground lay soft with old pine needles. "We sleep here." The second dropped his satchel at once. At last! The youngest gathered fallen branches while the others rested. Soon a small fire crackled softly between them, warm and golden against the deepening dark. Above, the stars appeared one by one between the branches. The eldest stretched out near the fire. "We rise early." "You always say that," muttered the second. "And yet we always rise." The youngest sat quietly for a while, listening to the forest around them. The fire murmured softly. Leaves shifted overhead. Far away, an owl called once into the night. Strange as the forest still was, he found he didn't mind sleeping there. It felt alive, as though even in darkness the trees were quietly keeping watch. By morning, the air smelt washed and green. A light rain had passed some time in the night, leaving droplets resting upon fern leaves and moss. The eldest rose first. "We move." The second groaned but followed. The youngest carefully scattered the ashes of the fire and covered them with damp earth before joining them on the path. Morning sunlight filtered softly through the trees. Wildflowers appeared more often now. White blossoms, tiny blue ones, golden flowers opening wherever sunlight touched the forest floor. And among them, bees. At first only one or two, then many, golden bodies drifting lazily between blossoms. The youngest slowed. Without thinking, his hand brushed against the satchel at his side. Inside rested the little pearwood comb his father had given him. He remembered his mother standing beside the old hives near the orchard. She'd never hurried among the bees, never frightened them. "Bees remember kindness," she used to say. And once, when he had asked why she moved so gently, she had smiled. "Honey should be taken with gratitude," she told him. "Never greed." Ahead, the eldest suddenly stopped. "Well now." At the edge of the path stood an enormous linden tree. High, within one hollow branch, hung a wild hive larger than the youngest had ever seen. Golden bees drifted steadily in and out of the opening. The sound of them filled the clearing. A soft humming, steady, peaceful, alive. The second brother tilted his head back. "There must be honey enough there for days." "At least," said the eldest. He glanced toward the forest floor. Dry pine needles lay gathered nearby. A fallen branch rested not far away. "We could smoke them out." The youngest felt something inside him grow quiet. Again. The eldest had already begun gathering pine needles. The second crouched beside him. "And no breakfast left," he said. "A little honey would do nicely." "There are berries still," the youngest said gently. The eldest sighed. "Berries again? Enough to eat?" The eldest shook his head. "You would choose berries over honey?" "I would choose leaving them in peace." The second rolled his eyes. "They're insects." "They are alive." The eldest straightened. "One little fire beneath the hollow. The bees will leave." The youngest stepped forward. Not hurriedly, not dramatically. Simply enough to stand between the tree and his brothers. Firm. Quiet. Certain. "No." The eldest frowned. "You would stop us again?" "Yes." The second crossed his arms. "Over bees." The youngest glanced upward. The hive hummed softly in the morning warmth. Returning, leaving, returning again, busy with their quiet work. "Our mother kept bees once," he said softly. Neither brother answered. "She said honey should be taken with gratitude. Never greed." The eldest gave a short laugh. "Then mother had less appetite than I." The youngest met his gaze calmly. "If you mean to smoke them out," he said gently, "you must first move me." For a moment, no one spoke. The bees hummed softly overhead. Wildflowers stirred in the breeze. The eldest brother looked hungry, too tired, mostly annoyed. "And you would stand there all day?" "If I must." The second shook his head. "You are so troublesome." "Perhaps," the youngest said mildly, "but not today." At last the eldest dropped the pine needles back to the ground. "Fine," the second laughed. "There goes breakfast." "There's enough in the forest," said the youngest quietly. The eldest shook his head. "One day your softness will cost you dearly." "Perhaps, but not today." The brothers continued down the path. The youngest lingered only a moment. He touched the smooth pearwood comb inside his satchel. Then, standing beneath the hive, he bowed his head ever so slightly. Not because he expected anything in return, only because kindness, he thought, deserved kindness. One bee drifted lazily downward. It circled near him once, then returned to the hive. The youngest smiled, and somewhere, in the old hidden places of the forest, enchantment stirred once more, for kindness, quietly given, is rarely forgotten. The forest changed after the brothers passed the great linden tree. The path grew quieter, not silent exactly, but quieter, as though the woods themselves had begun listening. Birdsong faded, even the wind moved more softly through the branches overhead. By afternoon, the trees thinned at last. Sunlight opened ahead. The eldest brother straightened at once. "At last!" The second quickened his pace. "Perhaps we've finally found something worth all this walking." The youngest followed quietly behind. When they stepped beyond the shelter of the trees, they found themselves among the edge of an enormous garden, or what had once been one. Stone paths curved between hedges grown long and wild. Roses climbed untended over marble walls, blooming freely as though no gardener had touched them in years. Ivy climbed old fountains where the water stood perfectly still. And beyond it stood a castle. Tall towers rose pale against the afternoon sky. Sunlight gleamed softly across the high windows. Vines climbed the old stone, and though no smoke rose from the chimneys, the place did not feel abandoned. Only waiting. The eldest brother smiled. "Well," the second grinned. "Now this feels promising." The great iron gates stood strangely open. No guards watched them. No voices drifted through the gardens. Only stillness. The youngest hesitated. "There's something unusual here." "There's something wealthy here," said the eldest. And with that, he walked through the gates. The others followed. The garden lay quiet around them. Butterflies drifted lazily among the flowers. A gardener sat beside a hedge, sleeping. Or so it seemed. Yet even when the brothers passed near, he didn't stir. Inside the castle, the silence deepened. Candles burned in silver holders. Dust rested softly upon polished tables. Dogs slept near fireplaces. Servants sat motionless in chairs as though sleep had found them in the middle of an ordinary task and simply forgotten to leave. The second lowered his voice. "I don't know if I like this place." "You liked it well enough outside," said the eldest. Then at the far end of the long table, they found someone awake. An old man sat alone beside a fire. His beard rested white against his chest, and his eyes looked tired in the way old mountains sometimes seem tired. He regarded them quietly. "You are late," he said. The brothers exchanged glances. "Late for what?" asked the eldest. "For breaking the enchantment." The old man gestured slowly around him. "This kingdom sleeps." The youngest looked carefully now. Not dead, sleeping. Every face peaceful, every room paused, as though time itself had simply stopped and forgotten how to move again. The eldest crossed his arms. "And how does one break it?" The old man studied him for a moment. "There are 3 tasks." At this, the eldest smiled. "Oh, good." "The first," the old man said, "must be completed before sunset." He pointed towards the gardens outside. 1,000 pearls belonging to the youngest princess were scattered through the moss and grass. The second frowned. 1,000? "Every one must be found," the old man continued. "If even one remains missing," he paused, "the one who fails becomes stone." For a moment, no one spoke. The eldest laughed. "That's all?" The old man said nothing. The eldest straightened proudly. "I shall finish by supper." The youngest looked toward the gardens. Wide, overgrown, the moss lay thick between roots and stones. Already you could see how easily something might disappear there. "Brother," he said quietly, "perhaps you should search carefully." The eldest waved him off. "I need no advice." And with that, he strode outside. At first, the task seemed simple. A pearl gleamed beneath moss, another near a fountain, another caught in ivy. The eldest smiled. "This is easier than I expected." Inside the castle, the second brother stretched comfortably near a fire. "If he succeeds," he said, "we shall all profit." The youngest stood near the window. Outside, he could see the eldest brother moving quickly through the gardens. Too quickly, searching with haste, missing corners, ignoring places where patience might have helped. The sun moved steadily downward. The pearls proved harder to find than expected. Some rested hidden beneath moss, others nestled deep among roots or beneath fallen leaves. The eldest grew impatient. He searched faster, looked less carefully. Twice he nearly stepped upon pearls he had overlooked. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. The shadows lengthened. The light softened. At last, as evening settled over the garden, the eldest returned to the hall. His face had darkened with frustration. The old man looked up. "Well?" The eldest emptied his pockets. Pearls scattered across the table. Many, but nowhere near enough. "This task is impossible," he snapped. The old man rose slowly. "No," he said quietly. "Only unfinished." Then, before anyone could speak, a strange stillness swept through the room. The eldest brother froze, only for a breath. Surprise crossed his face. And then, silence. In the space of a moment, where he had stood remained a figure of gray stone, perfectly still, hands half curled at his sides, expression unchanged. The second brother stepped backward. The youngest stared. The hall grew quiet once more. The old man lowered himself slowly into his chair. "One task failed," he said softly. Outside, evening settled gently across the sleeping kingdom, and somewhere far beyond the castle walls, unseen in the deepening dusk, ants moved patiently through their little hidden kingdom beneath the roots of the old chestnut tree. Morning came softly to the sleeping castle. Golden light stretched through the tall windows and rested quietly across polished floors. Dust drifted lazily through the still air, glowing whenever sunlight touched it. Nothing else moved. The servants remained asleep where they sat. Dogs still rested before cold fireplaces. Even the clocks upon the walls stood silent, in their hands, unmoving. Only the man near the fire seemed awake, and the two remaining brothers. One quiet, one uneasy. The middle brother stood staring at the stone figure of his elder brother. He circled it once, then folded his arms. "Well," he said at last, "that seems rather extreme." The youngest said nothing. His brother's expression hadn't changed. Still impatient, still certain, only now silent. The middle brother shook his head. "He should have searched more carefully." The old man lifted his eyes. "He was warned." The middle brother frowned. Yes. He glanced toward the tall windows. 1,000 pearls in a garden is hardly fair." The youngest thought quietly of moss, roots, small hidden places, patience. Still, he said nothing. At last the middle brother straightened his coat. "Well then," he gave a small smile, "I suppose the matter belongs to me now." The old man nodded. "The second task must be completed before sunset." He rose slowly and led them through the castle. Long halls stretched silent around them. Portraits watched from tall walls. Sleeping servants rested beside cold fireplaces. At last, they stepped outside. Beyond the gardens lay a lake. It rested smooth and still beneath the morning sky, ringed by willow trees whose branches dipped low across the water. Dragonflies skimmed quietly over the surface. White flowers floated near the reeds. Everything about the place felt peaceful. The old man pointed toward the center. "The key to the princess's chamber lies somewhere beneath the water." The middle brother blinked. "The entire lake?" The old man nodded. "You must find it before sunset." "And if I fail?" The old man's expression didn't change. "You already know." The middle brother looked toward the lake again, then laughed once. "A single key." He rolled up his sleeves. "This should hardly take an hour." The youngest glanced toward the still water. The lake seemed deeper than it first appeared. The surface reflected the clouds so perfectly that it felt difficult to tell where the sky ended and water began. "Brother," he said quietly, "perhaps you should search slowly." The middle brother sighed. "You worry too much." And with that, he stepped into the water. At first, confidence carried him easily. He searched near the shore, then farther out. He peered beneath the surface, reached into the mud, turned over stones. Still nothing. By midday, annoyance had replaced confidence. He searched faster, more carelessly, splashed through reeds, muttered complaints beneath his breath. How can one key disappear into an entire lake? The youngest sat quietly beneath a willow tree. He watched dragonflies drift above the water. Ducks glided quietly near the far reeds. Somewhere overhead, birds moved through the branches. The lake itself seemed patient, unhurried, as though time mattered very little here. The middle brother grew more frustrated. He searched one side of the lake, then the other. He blamed the water, the mud, the task, the old man. At one point, he kicked a stone into the shallows so sharply that nearby ducks scattered. "This is impossible," he muttered. The youngest looked toward the ducks. The same quiet stirring touched him again. The feeling that kindness mattered somehow, even here. Then the sun lowered. The light softened. At last, soaked and irritated, the middle brother climbed from the water. The old man stood waiting near the shore. "Well?" he asked. The middle brother spread his hands. "There is no key." The old man regarded him quietly. "No," he said softly. "There was only no patience." The middle brother frowned. "That's nonsense." Then the air grew strangely still. The youngest felt the quiet change all around him. His brother looked suddenly uncertain. "No, now wait a moment." But already the stillness had reached him. In only a breath, where he had stood remained a figure of gray stone. Hands half raised in protest, expression frozen somewhere between annoyance and disbelief. The lake grew quiet once more. The youngest stood alone beside the water. Two brothers, two choices, two still figures waiting in silence. The old man sighed softly. "Two tasks failed." The youngest looked over to the lake. Evening gathered gently among the reeds. Nearby, ducks drifted quietly across the silvering water. One smaller duck paddled faithfully beside another. The youngest smiled faintly. Then very softly he said, "Well, I suppose it's only us now." And somewhere upon the quiet water, something small seemed to stir. Morning came quietly once more to the sleeping castle. Golden light stretched through the tall windows and rested softly across the polished floors. Dust drifted lazily through the still air, glowing whenever sunlight touched it. Nothing else moved. The servants remained asleep where they sat. Dogs still rested before cold fireplaces, and even the clocks rested upon the walls stood silent, their hands unmoving. Only the man near the fire seemed awake, and the youngest brother alone. For a while he stood quietly in the great hall. One stone figure stood near the garden door, the other near the lake-facing windows. His brothers, still, silent, waiting in the strange, unmoving way stone waits. The youngest rested his hands briefly against the cool stone sleeve of the middle brother. "I wish things had gone differently," he said softly. Then after a moment, "But you were warned." He didn't speak it unkindly, nor sad exactly, only truthfully. For he had loved his brothers in the way one loves difficult people, with patience and hope, and even when they made poor choices. At last he turned toward the fire. The old man already waited there. "You may leave if you wish," the old man said quietly. "No shame follows those who turn back." The youngest brother thought for a moment. Outside the tall windows, morning rested softly over the sleeping gardens. Beyond them lay the forest, the long road home. His father waiting beside the fire, the little house near the woods. But something, quiet inside of him, settled. "No," he said gently. "I think I should like to finish." The old man studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "The tasks remain unfinished." He rose slowly. "Come." First they walked to the gardens. The morning dew still rested upon the moss where the eldest brother had searched so impatiently. The old man gestured quietly. "1,000 pearls," he said. "Every one." The youngest looked across the wide garden. Moss spread thick beneath the hedges. Roots twisted beneath old trees. Tiny white glimmers disappeared easily among the leaves and shadow. He knelt, carefully, patiently, and then the earth stirred. At first only slightly, a movement near the roots of a chestnut tree. Then another, and another. The youngest blinked. Ants. Hundreds of them. No, thousands. They moved in shining little lines through the moss, carrying tiny pearls one by one. Some balanced them overhead. Others worked together where roots tangled thickly. The youngest smiled softly. "Oh," he whispered. The old man watched without surprise. The ants came steadily, quietly, patiently, as though they had always expected to return. Before long, the final pearl rested gently beside the brother's young hand. He bowed his head slightly. "Thank you," he said. The ants continued their work a little longer, then disappeared quietly into the garden once more. "The first task is finished," said the old man. Next, they walked to the lake. Morning sunlight shimmered softly across the still water. Willow branches bent low over the shore. "The key," said the old man. The youngest nodded quietly. The lake rested wide and still before him. "It seems very large for one small key," he admitted. The water remained calm. Then a soft ripple moved through the reeds. A duck emerged. Then another, and another. The same small gathering he had once protected beside the pond. The youngest smiled. "Well," he said softly. "Hello again." The smallest duck paddled nearest. Then, with surprising determination, disappeared beneath the water. One by one, the others followed. The youngest waited quietly. No rushing, no demanding, only trust. At last, the smallest duck surfaced again, something gleaming gently in its beak. A silver key. The youngest laughed softly in surprise. "Oh my goodness!" He reached carefully toward the water. The duck placed the key near his hand. "Thank you," he said gently. "I truly mean that." The ducks lingered only for a moment, then drifted quietly back toward the reeds. "The second task is finished," said the old man. Together, they returned to the castle. The silver key turned softly within an old lock. At last, the prince's chamber opened. 3 sisters lay sleepily peaceful among embroidered beds. Golden afternoon light rested softly across the room. They looked so alike It seemed impossible to tell one from another. The old man spoke quietly. Before falling asleep, each princess tasted something different. He gestured toward them. One tasted sugar, one tasted syrup, one tasted honey. He paused. The youngest princess tasted honey. The youngest brother stepped closer. The sisters looked identical. Same hair, same peaceful expressions, same folded hands. He frowned gently. I don't know how anyone could tell. You must choose correctly before sunset, said the old man. And if I choose wrong, the old man's expression remained kind. You already know. Then he turned and left the room. The chamber grew quiet. Outside the windows, afternoon softened slowly toward evening. 3 sisters, 3 choices. No answer. The youngest sat quietly near the window. For a while he simply listened to silence, to the distant sound of wind moving softly through the garden below. Then, with a small sigh, he smiled to himself. I suspect, he said softly into the quiet room, that this may be beyond me. And then, through an open window, came a familiar sound. Soft, steady, a gentle humming in the evening air. The youngest looked up and smiled. Oh, he whispered softly. You. The soft humming grew nearer. Golden evening light drifted through the open window, warming the quiet chamber where the 3 sleeping princesses rested so peacefully. The youngest brother remained seated. He didn't rush to the window, didn't call out, only waited. And a moment later, a bee drifted gently into the room. Then another, then several more, small golden bodies humming softly in the evening air. At last, one settled upon the edge of the window, larger than the others, graceful somehow, calm. The youngest smiled faintly. Well, he said softly, I had hoped it might be you. Without thinking, his hand brushed lightly against the satchel at his side. The little pearwood comb rested still there, his father's gift, his mother's memory. The queen bee lifted briefly into the air, then circled around him, not hurriedly, almost thoughtfully. The youngest stood slow. I wonder, he said quietly, glancing toward the sleeping sisters, if perhaps you know something I do not. The bee hummed softly, then drifted toward the princesses. The room grew still. Golden light rested gently across embroidered blankets. Outside, evening birds called softly in the garden below. The queen hovered near the first sleeping princess. For a moment, she lingered, then lightly touched the princess's lips. Only briefly, then drifted away. Next came the second sister. Again, the queen bee hovered. Again, she touched gently at the sleeping lips, then moved on. The youngest stood very still. The quiet of the room seemed to deepen all around them. And at last, the queen bee drifted toward the third princess. She hovered there longer, touched the princess's lips once, then again, and at last settled softly upon her shoulder. Still, certain, the youngest smiled. Oh, he said softly, you've decided. The queen bee remained where she was. The youngest bowed his head ever so slightly. Thank you, he whispered. Then he turned. The old man stood waiting quietly in the doorway. I believe, said the youngest gently, that the youngest princess is this one. The old man looked toward the bee, then nodded once. You are correct. For one quiet moment, nothing happened. Then, the castle stirred. Not suddenly, not violently, but gently, like waking. Somewhere below, a clock began ticking, softly. Then another. The great stillness seemed to loosen from the walls. A fire crackled awake downstairs. Voices stirred faintly through the distant halls. Outside, birds lifted suddenly from the garden hedges. The sleeping princesses breathed deeper. And slowly, their eyes opened. The youngest stepped back. The third princess blinked softly in the fading light. For a moment, confusion crossed her face. Then wonder. "The enchantment," she whispered. Her sister stirred beside her. Beyond the chamber, footsteps echoed through the halls. Doors opened, voices rose, the castle awakened, and the old man smiled quietly. "It is finished." The youngest looked toward the window. The queen bee had lifted once into the evening air. The others followed after her, disappearing into the soft gold light outside. He smiled. "Thank you," he said again. The third princess rose slowly from her bed. Her voice remained soft. "And you stayed." The youngest considered this. "I suppose," he said gently, "I simply kept trying." The princess smiled, and somewhere below, bells began ringing softly through the castle towers. The sleeping kingdom had awakened at last. Yet, in the great hall below, 2 stone figures still stood, waiting in silence. The youngest glanced toward them. For the first time, the old man's expression softened. "Not all enchantments break at once," he said quietly. The youngest looked again at his brothers, still, silent, and waiting. And though he couldn't yet say what morning might bring, he found himself hoping that they had learned something during their long stillness. Outside, evening settled softly across the kingdom, and somewhere beyond the open window, bees drifted home through the fading gold of sunset. Morning arrived differently now. Not quiet, not sleeping. The castle had awakened. Sunlight spilled warmly through the long windows, while voices drifted softly through the halls. Servants moved once more, carrying fresh flowers and warm bread. Dogs wandered sleepily near fireplaces, as though unsure why such a long nap had ended. The youngest brother stood near the great hall windows. For the first time since arriving, the clocks ticked steadily once more. The kingdom had begun breathing again. Yet 2 figures stood quietly near the hearth. His brothers. Silent, stone, the youngest rested one hand lightly against the cool sleeve of the middle brother. "Well," he said softly, "I suspect you've had quite enough standing." Behind him came the slow sound of footsteps. The old man approached quietly, though somehow he no longer seemed quite so old, or perhaps only less burdened. "The enchantment has lifted," said the youngest gently. The old man nodded. "Most of it." The youngest looked again towards his brothers. "They are still here." "Yes." The old man's gaze softened. "Not all lessons arrive quickly." For a moment, the youngest said nothing. Then, "Will they remain this way?" The old man folded his hands. "No." The youngest felt something loosen quietly inside of him. Not exactly relief. Something gentler. Hope, perhaps. "But," the old man continued, "standing still has a way of teaching what hurriedness cannot." Morning sunlight rested softly across the stone figures. "They were not cruel beyond repair," he said quietly. "Only careless." The youngest nodded. That felt true. Careless with creatures, careless with patience, careless with kindness, but not beyond hope. The old man stepped forward. He rested one hand lightly against each stone shoulder. The room grew silent, strangely quiet. Softly, almost like frost melting in spring, the gray stone faded. Color returned. Breath returned. Movement. The eldest brother blinked suddenly. The middle brother stumbled quietly where he stood. Both looked around in confusion. The eldest frowned. "What happened?" The middle brother rubbed his arms. "Why do I feel as though I slept standing up?" The old man said nothing for a moment, only looked at them. "You were given time," he said quietly. The eldest looked embarrassed, though only slightly, and the middle brother avoided everyone's eyes. Neither seemed eager to speak of it. The youngest smiled faintly. "It is good to see you." The eldest cleared his throat. "Yes. Well, that seemed enough for now." By afternoon, the kingdom had fully awakened. Music drifted softly through the halls, long tables filled with food. The three princesses walked through the gardens once more, sunlight catching softly in their hair. The youngest princess spent much of the afternoon near the youngest brother. They spoke quietly between the fountains, walked slowly through the rose gardens, and discovered, to both their surprise, that neither minded silence very much. The elder brothers watched from a distance. The eldest shifted awkwardly. The middle brother rubbed the back of his neck. At last, the eldest approached one of the elder sisters. She smiled politely, kindly, but only after a few moments wandered away again. The middle brother fared a little better. The princesses were gracious, warm even, but something quieter remained between them. A distance not unkind, only honest. Trust, it seemed, had not yet arrived. The old man found the brothers later that evening. "Kindness," he said quietly, "is not something one earns all at once." Neither brother laughed. Neither rolled their eyes. For once, they simply listened. In time, the youngest brother chose to remain in the castle. Not because it was grand, though it was, and not because he had broken the enchantment, though he had, but because peace lived there now, and because wherever he walked beside the youngest princess, things somehow felt quietly easy. The elder brother stayed for a while, long enough to help repair broken garden walls, long enough to walk more slowly than before, long enough that neither found much joy in frightening small creatures anymore. And when at last they returned home, the road somehow felt longer than they remembered. Perhaps because they noticed more. The eldest paused once to step carefully around an anthill, though he pretended not to. The middle brother tossed crumbs near a pond and acted very annoyed by it. When at last the little house beside the forest came into view, their father stood waiting near the doorway, older somehow, but smiling. "You've returned," he said softly. "We have," said the eldest. And for the first time in many years the brothers stood together quietly beneath the evening sky while supper warmed inside. The forest rested peacefully nearby. Bees drifted lazily near the garden herbs. Birds settled themselves for the night. And if the world seemed softer than before, perhaps it was only because kindness, once noticed, becomes difficult to overlook. And so, in time, the youngest brother married the youngest princess, and the kingdom flourished. The elder brothers made quieter choices than before, and though they were never again quite as certain of themselves, they found this troubled them less than expected. For life, it turned out, felt gentler when walked thoughtfully. And somewhere, beyond the castle gardens, beneath old trees and beside quiet water, small creatures carried on with their quiet lives, still remembering kindness. And if stories are to be believed, perhaps kindness remembered them too. And now, the castle grows quiet once more. The lamps burn softly in the windows. The garden paths rest peacefully beneath the evening sky. And somewhere, near the water's edge, Ducks settle quietly among the reeds. Beneath old roots, tiny lives continue their careful work. And far from hurried voices, bees drift slowly home through the last golden light of day. Perhaps tonight is a good evening to leave the world a little quieter than we found it. Let the hurried thoughts soften. Let the heavy things rest for a while. And to remember that even the smallest kindnesses have a way of lingering, sometimes longer than we ever realize. So wherever this evening finds you, I hope there is warmth nearby, a soft place to rest, and the quiet comfort of knowing that gentleness still exists in this world. Thank you for spending this peaceful evening with me. Sleep now. You are safe, and you are loved. You've been listening to Nicki Woo Cozy Stories, created by Nicole T. Woodard. May your dreams be gentle and your sleep be deep.